What happens when a man who lost everything believes he is broken and the one woman who sees his worth refuses to let him fall? This is a story about betrayal, healing, and a love that grows in the ruins, where two wounded hearts discover that sometimes what feels like the end is only the beginning.
The restaurant was beautiful, all exposed brick, and Edison bulbs casting warm light over white tablecloths. Melissa Richards sat across from Jordan, her fingers tracing the stem of her untouched wine glass. Her dark brown skin glowed in the candlelight, her natural curls framing a face that always found reasons to smile, even now, even as she watched the man she'd loved for 2 years struggle to meet her eyes. "Melissa," Jordan said finally, his voice tight. "I'm sorry." Her stomach dropped. "Sorry for what?" He shifted in his seat, looking anywhere but at her. "This isn't working out. I've moved on." The words hit like a slap. Melissa's breath caught, her hands gripping the stem of her wine glass. "What do you mean you've moved on?" "Jordan, we've been together for 2 years. What happened? What did I do wrong?" "It's not about you, then what is it about?" Her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. She could feel tears threatening, her throat tight. "You owe me more than it's not working out. Please, just tell me why." Jordan finally looked at her, and his expression was distant, closed off. "There's no one reason, Melissa. It's not there anymore." "I'm sorry." She stared at him, searching his face for the man she'd loved. For any sign this was a nightmare she'd wake up from. Her hands were shaking now. "Is there someone else?" His hesitation told her everything. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Melissa, I'm sorry." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She grabbed her purse with trembling hands, blinking rapidly against the tears blurring her vision. "I have to go." "Melissa, wait, don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Just don't." She walked out of the restaurant on unsteady legs, barely making it outside before the first tears fell. The San Francisco fog was rolling in, cold against her flushed skin, and Melissa wrapped her arms around herself as she walked quickly down the street, trying to hold together pieces that were already breaking apart. Melissa's apartment was dark and quiet when she finally made it home. She cried in the Uber, held herself together in the elevator, with a forced smile at a neighbor. But the moment her door closed behind her, she shattered. She dropped her purse, kicked off her heels, and found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror. Her makeup was ruined, black streaks running down her cheeks. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked exactly how she felt, devastated. 2 years. She'd given him 2 years of her life, her love, her trust, and he'd moved on like it meant nothing. Melissa gripped the edge of the sink as a sob tore through her chest. The question she couldn't silence echoed in her mind. Why wasn't I enough? She slid down to the bathroom floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and let herself break. The city lights glittered through her window, indifferent to her breaking heart. Somewhere out there, Jordan had already moved on, and Melissa sat alone on her bathroom floor, trying to piece herself back together. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow she'd witness another kind of betrayal. And this time, she wouldn't be the one falling apart. She'd be the one holding someone else together. The next morning, the boardroom on the 42nd floor of Williams Tech was anything but beautiful. Christopher Williams stood at the head of the table, his jaw tight, blue eyes cold as winter, as he watched his empire crumble in real time. His dark blonde hair was perfectly styled, his tailored suit immaculate, but none of it mattered anymore. The 12 board members sat like judges, their faces carefully neutral, as his ex-wife, Victoria Harrison, stood beside the chairman with a smile that could cut glass. "Before we proceed with the vote," Board Member Richardson said, clearing his throat, "I want to reiterate that this decision comes after careful consideration of the company's future. Ms. Harrison has presented a comprehensive vision for Williams Tech's next phase, and given the recent instability in leadership, we believe this transition is in the best interest of our shareholders." Instability. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Christopher's eyes narrowed. Victoria had been busy during the divorce proceedings, not just taking half his wealth, but poisoning the very people he'd trusted to build this company with him. Ms. Harrison's strategic share acquisition through the settlement, another board member added, gives her significant voting power. Combined with her insight into the company's operations and her vision for growth, the board feels confident in this direction. Strategic shares. The divorce had given her exactly what she needed, not just money, but power. Shares that she'd carefully negotiated for. Shares that gave her leverage. And she'd spent the last months whispering in ears, presenting plans, positioning herself as the savior, while painting him as unstable, broken, unreliable. "The vote is final," Chairman Peterson announced. "Effective immediately. Christopher, William is removed as CEO of Williams Tech. Victoria Harrison will assume the position." Christopher's hands gripped the edge of the table. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of trying everything, doctors, specialists, treatments, only to learn that his body had betrayed him. Low sperm count, nearly impossible odds. The death of the legacy he'd always assumed would be his. He refused to surrender quietly. They poured hope into clinics and appointments, into charts and injections and whispered prayers in sterile waiting rooms. IVF using his sperm became their lifeline, their proof that they were still fighting. Each cycle carried fragile optimism. Each failure landed heavier than the last. Hope turned into routine, routine into dread. And Victoria had smiled through it all, until she didn't. Until he'd overheard her on the phone with another man, her voice soft and intimate in ways it hadn't been with him in months. Until she'd filed for divorce and taken half of everything he'd built. Until she'd manipulated these very board members, turned them against him with strategic shares and calculated whispers about his emotional state, his inability to focus, his personal struggles affecting company performance. "You can't do this," Christopher said, his voice deadly quiet. "We just did," Victoria replied, her brown eyes glittering with triumph. "You built something beautiful, Christopher. Too bad you couldn't hold on to it." The knife twisted, she knew. She knew exactly where to cut. Melissa stood near the back of the room, her tablet clutched to her chest. As Christopher's secretary and friend, she'd seen him build this company from the ground up. She'd watched him pour his soul into every innovation, every deal, every late night, and now she watched him bleed. The board members filed out like cowards. Victoria lingered. He didn't even remember what. "What the hell are you doing?" He strode forward, but she stepped between him and the counter. Her chin lifted defiantly. "What does it look like?" "That's a $1,000 bottle. I don't care if it's $10,000. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "You're killing yourself, Christopher." Slowly. "And I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen." They stood there inches apart, the amber liquid gurgling down the drain between them. He could smell her perfume, something light and citrusy. That made him think of sunshine. Her eyes held his, unflinching, and he saw something in them that made his chest tight. She cared, really cared, and he didn't deserve it. "Promise me," she said softly. "Promise me you won't buy more." Christopher wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she had no right. But looking at her, at the determination in her face, the worry in her eyes, the way she stood there like she'd fight him if she had to, he found himself nodding. "I promise." The tension left her shoulders. She reached out, hesitated, then squeezed his arm gently. "Thank you." For a long moment he just looked at her, this beautiful, stubborn woman standing in his kitchen like she belonged there, like she had every right to storm into his life and start making demands. Her natural curls were pulled back in a ponytail, her jeans and sweater casual, but somehow making her look even more radiant than she did in office clothes. "I don't deserve you here," he said quietly. "Good thing it's not about what you deserve," Melissa replied. "Now go shower. You smell like a distillery." After she left that night, Christopher stood in his empty apartment and felt something he hadn't felt in months, accountable. Not to the board, not to Victoria, to Melissa, to someone who actually gave a damn. She started coming every day, sometimes in the morning, bringing coffee from that little place on Divisadero that made it exactly how he liked it. Black, no sugar, hot enough to burn. She'd hand it to him, and they'd sit on his balcony, watching the city wake up, saying little but somehow saying everything. She cooked. God, she cooked like it was her love language. Creole dishes that reminded her of family jambalaya, gumbo, red beans, and rice. The smell filled his empty apartment, with something that felt dangerously close to home. "You need to eat," she'd say, setting a plate in front of him. "I'm not hungry." "I don't care. Eat anyway." And he would, because when Melissa Richard told you to do something in that particular tone, you did it, because underneath the gentleness was steel, and underneath the steel was a love so fierce it terrified him. Melissa watched him with those haze eyes, and he felt seen in a way that made him want to hide. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. She was quiet for a long moment, Her fingers loosely held her fork, because someone has to, and because she trailed off, something flickering across her face. Because you'd do the same for me, would he? Christopher wasn't sure he was capable of doing anything for anyone anymore. But he took another bite of her well-cooked food anyway. A pattern emerged over the following weeks. Melissa showed up one evening in sneakers and a jacket, her hair loose around her shoulders, in coils that caught the fading light. "Come on," she said. "We're going out." "I don't, not a request." They drove to Ocean Beach in her car that smelled faintly of vanilla air freshener. She parallel parked terribly, took 3 tries and still ended up crooked, and he found himself almost smiling despite everything. The beach stretched out before them, the Pacific churning grey and infinite. A few die-hard surfers bobbed in the waves. The wind whipped cold and sharp, carrying the salt spray smell that was quintessentially San Francisco. They walked in silence at first, their shoes crunching on the sand. Melissa had her hands shoved in her pockets, her face tilted toward the water like she was drinking in the view. "I love this place," she said eventually. "No matter how bad things get, the ocean's always here. Always constant. Always beautiful." Christopher glanced at her. "How do you do that? Do what? See beauty in everything?" He gestured vaguely at the grey sky, the cold wind, the trash scattered along the seawall. "Even when everything's falling apart." Melissa stopped walking and turned to face him. The wind caught her hair, and she had to push it back from her face. "Because beauty's always there, Christopher. Even in the broken things. Especially in the broken things." Something in her voice made him wonder if she was talking about the beach, or about someone else. They walked until the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible after the grey of the day. And when Melissa drove him home, Christopher felt a little less heavy. 6 months passed like that. Morning coffee, evening walks, late-night conversations on his couch, where they'd talk about everything and nothing. Her difficult childhood in Sacramento, his drive to prove his absent father wrong, the dreams they'd had before life got complicated. Melissa told him about her ex-boyfriend, how he'd asked her to dinner just to break up with her, how he'd said it's not working out, but was actually seeing someone else for months. "I thought we were building something," she said one night, her voice soft in the dim light of his living room. "Turns out I was building alone." Christopher felt rage on her behalf, white-hot and protective. "He's an idiot," she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. She pulled her knees to her chest, looking smaller than usual. "I used to think love was enough. That if you loved someone hard enough, believed enough, it would work out. But sometimes love isn't enough, is it?" He didn't have an answer for that. But sitting there in the darkness, watching the way the city lights reflected in her eyes, Christopher realized something terrifying. He was falling for her. No, he'd already fallen, somewhere between the morning coffees and beach walks, between her throwing away his whiskey and forcing him to eat, between her laughter and her tears, and her stubborn refusal to give up on him. He'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with Melissa Richard. And it was impossible. The realization consumed him. But what could he offer her? He was a failed husband, a man so broken his own wife had betrayed him, a man who couldn't even give Victoria the one thing she'd wanted: a child, a legacy, proof that he was a man worth staying for. The doctor's words echoed in his mind: low motility, extremely low probability, perhaps 1% chance, if that. He'd failed Victoria in the one way that mattered, the one way a man was supposed to come through. And when she'd realized he couldn't give her children, she'd found someone who could. How could he ask Melissa to step into that same failure? She wanted children. He'd seen the way she looked at kids in the park during their walks, the softness in her eyes. She deserved a man who could give her everything. A family, a future. Not a broken ex-CEO with nothing to offer, but shame and empty promises. But God, he loved her. The feeling grew stronger every day until his chest ached with it, until every moment she was gone felt like holding his breath, and every moment she was near felt like finally breathing again. Melissa sensed something changing. She started looking at him differently, longer glances, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to read something written there. Sometimes when they walked on the beach, she'd lean into him slightly, her shoulder brushing his arm. Small touches that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. One evening, they were at Ocean Beach watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and gold, and Melissa was laughing at something he couldn't even remember what. Her face tilted up to catch the last light. The wind caught her hair, and without thinking, Christopher reached out to tuck a curl behind her ear. She stilled. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just them. The crash of waves faded. The cold wind disappeared. There was only Melissa, looking at him with something raw and vulnerable in her expression, and Christopher's heart hammering against his ribs. Say something, he thought. Do something. But fear froze him in place. Melissa's expression shifted, something like disappointment flickering across her face, before she smiled and turned back to the water. We should head back. It's getting cold. The moment shattered. Christopher dropped his hand and nodded, hating himself. It happened again 2 weeks later. They were in his penthouse cooking dinner together. Melissa was at the stove stirring pasta sauce when she turned to ask him something and found him staring. She paused mid-sentence, wooden spoon held aloft, and something passed between them again. That same electric current, that same unspoken question. Christopher's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He looked away first, and when he looked back, Melissa had turned back to the stove, her shoulders tight. He was losing his chance. He could feel it slipping through his fingers like sand, and he was too much of a coward to hold on. This was Melissa who saw beauty in broken things. Maybe she could see beauty in him too. The thought was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. 3 weeks later, Christopher made a decision. He was going to tell her. He was going to take her to dinner and lay it all out. The infertility, the shame, the love he could no longer hide, and then he was going to let her decide. Let her walk away if that's what she needed, because she deserved the choice. He made reservations at Boulevard, the restaurant overlooking the ferry building. Somewhere beautiful, somewhere worthy of the conversation that would change everything. He called her. "Melissa, are you free Friday night?" "Always," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "What's up, dinner?" "There's something I need to tell you." A pause, then, "Okay, Friday night." He hung up and stared at his phone. His heart was racing, his palms sweating like he was 19 again instead of 35. This was right. This was what he needed to do. Friday came. Christopher showered, dressed in his best suit, checked his reflection a dozen times. He got in his car, started driving toward the restaurant, and made it exactly 3 blocks before the panic hit. What was he doing? What was he thinking? Melissa had given him 6 months of her life. She'd put her own healing on hold to fix him. She'd sacrificed her job, her time, her energy for what? So he could drag her into his mess. So he could watch her realize eventually that he couldn't give her what she deserved. That he was fundamentally broken in a way that mattered. The doctor's words, 1% chance, if that. Victoria's voice on the phone, breathy with another man. The board's faces, cold and final. "We vote to remove Christopher William as CEO." Christopher's breath came short and sharp. The walls of the car felt like they were closing in. He couldn't do this. He couldn't ask Melissa to tie herself to a man with no company, no legacy, no future. A man who couldn't even promise her children. What kind of man asks a woman to love him when he has nothing to give? His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The restaurant was 5 minutes away. Melissa was probably already there, waiting for him in that dress she'd mentioned buying, with that smile that made his world make sense. He turned left instead of right. The bar on Mission Street was exactly what he needed. Dark, anonymous, hand-serving the kind of whiskey that made you forget you'd promised to be better. Christopher sat at the counter and ordered a double, his phone buzzing in his pocket with a call he couldn't bring himself to answer. The restaurant was perfect. Melissa sat at the table Christopher had reserved, a corner spot with a view of the ferry building lit up against the night sky. She'd worn the sapphire crystal dress she'd bought specifically for tonight, the one that made her brown skin luminous, the one that hugged her curves in ways that made her feel beautiful and confident. Her curls were styled, her makeup flawless, her heart racing with anticipation. "There's something I need to tell you." His words had played in her mind all week. She'd let herself hope, let herself imagine what he might say. That he felt it too, this thing growing between them. That maybe, just maybe, they could stop pretending they were just friends. She checked her phone. 7:15. He was 15 minutes late. The waiter came by for the 3rd time. "Would you like to order a drink while you wait?" "Just water, thank you," Melissa said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. 7:30, she called. It went to voicemail. 7:45, she called again. Voicemail. 8 o'clock. The waiter's sympathetic look was worse than anything. Melissa felt the tears prickling behind her eyes. The familiar ache of being left, of not being enough. Jordan's face flashed in her mind. I've moved on. But this wasn't Jordan. This was Christopher. Christopher, who'd cried on her shoulder, who'd let her into his darkest moments, who looked at her sometimes like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Unless she'd imagined it all. 8:15. Melissa stood, leaving cash on the table for the water she'd barely touched, and walked out into the San Francisco night with her head high and her heart cracking. The bar was a dive, all scarred wood and dim lighting and the smell of spilled beer. Christopher sat hunched over his third whiskey, the amber liquid burning, a path down his throat that matched the burning in his chest. He'd abandoned her, left her sitting in a restaurant waiting for him like a fool. The phone in his pocket had stopped buzzing an hour ago, and somehow that was worse than when it had been ringing. "You're drinking like your world is crumbling," a voice said beside him. Christopher glanced over. The man who'd taken the stool next to him was probably same age with him, or maybe older, with kind eyes and the look of someone who'd seen hard times. His clothes were clean but worn, his hands calloused. "I guess it must be a woman," the man continued, signaling the bartender for a beer. Christopher let out a bitter laugh. What gave it away? Only two things make a man drink like that: money or love. And you've got the look of someone who's got money, but lost everything that matters. It was so accurate that Christopher actually turned to look at him properly. "You're pretty observant for a stranger." "Andrew," the man said, extending his hand. "And I recognize expensive suits and cheap pain when I see them." "Christopher." They shook hands. "What about you? What's your poison?" Andrew took a long pull of his beer. "A beautiful, incredible woman I don't deserve, yet she's the only reason I breathe." The words hit Christopher like a punch. He stared at Andrew, this stranger, who'd just voiced the exact thing Christopher felt about Melissa. "What do you mean you don't deserve her?" "I mean, I'm broke," Andrew said simply. "I've got a master's in engineering, a prototype that could change the tech industry, and about $200 in my bank account. My wife," his voice softened when he said the word, "my wife works 2 jobs to keep us afloat while I chase a dream that might never happen. She believes in me, but I can't even give her a decent dinner out." "What's the prototype?" Christopher asked, something stirring in him despite the whiskey haze. Andrew's eyes lit up. "AI-integrated smart home system, but not like anything on the market. It actually learns, adapts to individual needs, predicts problems before they happen. I've been developing it for 5 years, but I need capital for materials, testing, patents." He trailed off. "Sorry, you didn't come to a bar to hear a sales pitch." "No," Christopher said slowly, "but maybe I needed to hear it anyway." They talked for an hour. Andrew explained his vision, his challenges, his dreams. Christopher found himself drawn in, his mind the part that hadn't touched alcohol yet, already seeing the possibilities, the market gaps, the potential. "How much do you need?" Christopher asked. Andrew laughed. "More than I'll ever have. 200,000 minimum, to even start properly." Christopher pulled out his phone, typed something, showed Andrew the screen. "This is my investment firm. I'll transfer 300,000 Monday morning. We'll be partners 60-40 split. You keep majority since it's your vision. I'll handle the business side. You handle the innovation." Andrew's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. You're serious?" "Dead serious." Christopher's blue eyes were clearer than they'd been all night. "I've spent 6 months drowning because I lost everything. But you just reminded me that I didn't lose my mind. I didn't lose my ability to recognize brilliance when I hear it. I don't know what to say," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you doesn't even. Just promise me something," Christopher interrupted. "Don't give up on your wife. Don't let fear or shame or feeling like you're not enough make you push away the person who loves you." Andrew studied him carefully. "Is that what you're doing? With your woman?" "She's not Christopher stopped. "I can't give her what she deserves. Does she get to decide that, or do you?" The question hung in the air between them. Andrew stood, clapping Christopher on the shoulder. "Thank you for the opportunity, and for what it's worth. Don't give up on love, not when it's real." He left his contact information, shook Christopher's hand one more time, and walked out of the bar with a lighter step than he'd come in with. Christopher sat there, staring at his empty glass. Andrew's words echoing in his head. "Does she get to decide that, or do you?" He'd made the decision for her. He'd decided he wasn't enough. Decided she deserved better. Decided to walk away before she could reject him first. He'd left her sitting in a restaurant because he was a coward, and suddenly that was unacceptable. Christopher threw money on the bar and left. Melissa's apartment was small but warm, filled with plants and artwork, and the kind of life that made a space feel like home. She'd made it back an hour ago, cried in the shower, and changed into sweats and an old t-shirt. Her makeup was washed off. Her dress hung on the back of her bedroom door like an accusation. She was curled on her couch, a cup of tea cooling in her hands when the knock came. Her heart jumped. She knew somehow, before she even looked through the peephole. Christopher stood in her doorway, his suit rumpled, his hair a mess, his blue eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Melissa," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "I'm so sorry." She should not open the door, should tell him to leave, should protect her heart the way she'd learned to do after Jordan, after every disappointment that had taught her that loving people meant preparing to lose them. But this was Christopher, and she'd never been able to turn him away. "You left me there," Melissa said, her voice cracking. "I waited for 2 hours, Christopher. 2 hours wondering what I'd done wrong." "Nothing," he said quickly, stepping forward. "God, Melissa, nothing. You did nothing wrong. This is all me. This is all my fear and my shame and my—" He broke off, his hands shaking. Melissa opened the door. "Come inside," she said quietly. They stood in her small living room, the space between them feeling like miles. Christopher ran his hands through his hair, his carefully constructed composure completely shattered. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice rough. "I should have told you months ago, but I was too afraid, too ashamed." Melissa waited, her heart pounding. "My ex-wife didn't just divorce me for the company," Christopher said. "She divorced me because I failed her, because I'm—" His voice broke. "I'm infertile, Melissa. Low sperm count, practically impossible odds. We tried for 3 years, tried everything, and it never happened. And she blamed me. Hell, I blamed me." Melissa felt tears spring to her eyes, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. "I overheard her on the phone with another man, heard her talk about me like I was nothing, like I'd broken some promise I didn't even know I'd made. She took everything, the company, the money, but what destroyed me was knowing it was my fault, that I couldn't give her the one thing a man is supposed to give his wife. Christopher, I was going to tell you tonight," he continued, the words pouring out now like a dam had burst. "I was going to tell you that I'm in love with you, that I've been in love with you since the day you challenged me and poured my drinks away. But then I got scared. What future can I offer you when I can't even promise you a child? What kind of man asks a woman like you, beautiful, incredible, deserving of everything, to settle for someone who's fundamentally incomplete? So I went to a bar," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I sat there drowning in self-pity until I met a man named Andrew. A man who's poor but in love, who has a dream but no resources. And you know what I did? I offered to sponsor his prototype, to be his partner, because even in my lowest moment, I could see that his dream deserved a chance." Christopher took a shuddering breath. "Andrew told me not to give up on love, and I realized that I'm not here to burden you with a future I think isn't good enough. But I need you to know the truth. I need you to know that you're the only reason I survived these last months. And for the sake of our friendship, for the sake of what we have, I can't afford to lose that too. Please forgive me." Melissa's tears were falling freely now. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around him. Christopher collapsed into her embrace, his own tears coming hard and fast, his body shaking with the weight of everything he'd been carrying alone. "I'm sorry," he sobbed into her shoulder. "I'm so sorry." "Shh," Melissa whispered, her hands in his hair, her own tears soaking into his suit. "I've got you. I've got you." They sank to the floor together, Christopher's head on her shoulder, her arms around him as he shattered. All the grief he'd held back for his marriage, his company, his belief in himself came pouring out. And Melissa held him through it all, her tears mixing with his, her heart breaking and mending all at once. "You think you're broken," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "But Christopher, you're not. You're not broken." "How can you say that?" he whispered. "Because broken things can't love like you do. Broken things can't give the way you gave Andrew his dream tonight. Broken things don't make me feel the way you make me feel." He pulled back enough to look at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "And how do I make you feel?" Melissa cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs wiping away his tears. "Like I'm home," she said simply. "Like everything that ended before was just making room for this. They sat there on her floor, the San Francisco night quiet around them, holding each other like they were the only two people in the world. And maybe in that moment they were. 3 months after that night on her floor, Christopher and Andrew's startup occupied a converted warehouse in Soma. The space was raw exposed brick, high ceilings, the smell of fresh paint and ambition. Their prototype was working, better than working. It was revolutionary. Melissa stopped by after work, carrying coffee and that smile that made Christopher's entire day rearrange itself around her presence. She'd kept her job at the marketing firm, thrived there actually, but she still found time for him, always found time. "Show me," she said, setting the coffee on his desk. Christopher's blue eyes lit up the way they always did when he talked about the work. He pulled up the interface on his screen, walked her through the latest updates. His dark blonde hair was slightly messy, his sleeves rolled up, and Melissa had to remind herself to focus on the technology, and not the way his forearms looked when he gestured enthusiastically. "It's incredible," she said, meaning it. "You and Andrew are going to change everything." "We're getting close," Christopher admitted. He looked at her, really looked at her the way her natural curls framed her face. The intelligence in her hazel eyes, the curve of her neck. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You did this yourself," Melissa said softly. "No." He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "You gave me the strength to try again." The air between them thickened. It happened like this sometimes. Moments where the careful friendship they maintained threatened to combust into something they were both too afraid to name. Andrew walked in, breaking the spell. "Melissa, just in time. Tell Christopher that we need to hire a marketing director before launch." "You need to hire a marketing director before launch," Melissa said without missing a beat. Christopher laughed and the moment passed, but the feeling didn't. It never did anymore. They were everywhere together, but never together. Coffee at Sightglass, where they'd sit for hours talking about everything and nothing. Walks through Golden Gate Park, watching the fog roll over the eucalyptus trees. Dinners at hole-in-the-wall restaurants in the Mission, where Melissa would make Christopher try foods he'd never heard of, and he'd pretend to hate them while secretly loving her adventurousness. People assumed they were a couple. Waiters asked if it was one check. Friends made comments. Strangers smiled at them like they were witnessing something beautiful. But they never touched beyond the casual a hand on a shoulder, a brief hug goodbye. They never said the words that lived in their throats. Every time they looked at each other, Melissa would go home to her apartment and lie in bed, wondering why he wouldn't just ask. She knew he loved her. Christopher would stand in his penthouse overlooking the bay, gripping the balcony railing as he fought the urge to call her, and ask if they could finally define what they were. He had told her he loved her, but he still hadn't asked if they could be more than friends. He loved her. God, he loved her so much it physically hurt. But loving her meant asking her to choose him, choose a future that might not include the children she deserved. And every time he got close to saying it, the shame would rise up and choke the words before they could form. Melissa could feel him pulling away even as he drew closer, could see the war in his eyes every time they said goodbye. She wanted to shake him, to tell him that she'd already chosen, that she'd been choosing him every day for months. But she'd learned from that night on her floor that Christopher needed to come to her, needed to believe he was worth loving before he could accept being loved. So she waited. And the waiting was agony. 6 months after their company incorporation, Christopher decided he couldn't wait anymore. He'd watched Melissa light up a room at a tech networking event the week before, watched men gravitate toward her like she was the sun. She'd laughed at their jokes, been gracious and warm, and Christopher had felt something primal and possessive rise in his chest. That had nothing to do with friendship. She wasn't his, but God, he wanted her to be. "Come to dinner," he said when he called her on a Thursday evening. "My place, tomorrow night." "Is everything okay?" Melissa asked, hearing something different in his voice. "Everything's," Christopher paused. "I just want to see you, please." "Okay," she said softly. "Tomorrow night." He spent all of Friday preparing, cooking, actually cooking, following a recipe for coq au vin that he'd found online. Candles on the dining table, wine breathing on the counter. The apartment was spotless, the lighting perfect, and Christopher had changed his shirt 3 times before settling on the blue button down that Melissa had once said brought out his eyes. When she arrived, his breath caught. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her curves. her natural curls loose around her shoulders. Her dark skin glowed in the candlelight. And when she smiled at him, Christopher forgot how to form words. "You cooked," Melissa said, surprise and delight mixing in her voice as she smelled the air. "Don't sound so shocked," Christopher said, finding his voice. "I'm capable of more than reheating takeout." "Since when?" "Since I wanted to do something special for you." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Melissa's heart started racing as she followed him into the dining room, took in the candles, the carefully set table, the effort he'd clearly put into this. They sat, they ate. The food was actually good, and Christopher looked so proud of himself that Melissa wanted to kiss him right there. "Tell me about the prototype," she said instead, because she needed to focus on something, other than how beautiful he looked in candlelight. Christopher's eyes lit up. "We're 3 weeks from launch. The beta testing has been incredible beyond anything Andrew and I hoped for. We've got investors circling, companies already asking about licensing." He paused. "We need to hire a team. A real team." "That's amazing, Christopher. Come work for us," he said suddenly. "Head of marketing." "You'd be perfect for it." Melissa set down her wine glass. "Christopher, I know it's sudden, but Melissa, you're brilliant. You understand the vision, you know how to talk to people, how to make them care about something." And he stopped, his jaw working. "And I want you there. I want you to be part of this." "Any time," Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. "Any day you want me to quit my job, I will. Just say the word." The air shifted. Christopher stood, moving to the window, his back to her. The San Francisco skyline glittered beyond the glass. The Bay Bridge lit up like a strand of diamonds, the Transamerica Pyramid piercing the night sky. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice rough. "I've been trying to say it for months, but I keep—" He broke off, his hands gripping the window frame. "I'm terrified, Melissa." She stood, moving to him but not touching. "Of what?" "Of this, of us, of everything I feel when I look at you." He turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "I love you. I'm so completely in love with you that it consumes me. Every thought, every moment, every decision I make, it all comes back to you." Melissa's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "But I can't ask this of you," Christopher continued, his voice breaking. "I can't ask you to build a life with me, when I can't promise you children, when I might never be able to give you the family you deserve. I'm not whole, Melissa. She kissed him, stepped forward, cupped his face in her hands, and pressed her lips to his with months of longing and love and absolute certainty. Christopher froze for half a second. Then his hands came up to her waist and he pulled her against him, like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. The kiss deepened, desperate and hungry, and full of everything they'd been holding back. "You don't get to decide my future for me," Melissa said when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard. "You don't get to choose what I deserve. That's my choice, Christopher. And I choose you, Melissa." "I choose you," she repeated, her hand still on his face, her hazel eyes fierce. "Not despite what you think you can't give me, but because of who you are, because you make me laugh, because you're brilliant and kind, and broken in all the ways that make you real, because I've been in love with you since you cried on that beach, and let me see the parts of you that you hide from everyone else." Christopher's hands tightened on her waist. "I can't promise you, I don't care about promises," Melissa interrupted. "I care about now. About this moment. About building something beautiful with you, whatever that looks like." He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. His hands slid into her hair. Hers gripped his shoulders, and they stumbled backward until her back hit the wall. The kiss was consuming, all-encompassing, 8 months of restraint breaking like a dam. "Melissa," he breathed against her lips. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Christopher lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist as he carried her to his bedroom. They left a trail of careful restraint behind them, her shoes in the hallway, his shirt on the bedroom floor. He laid her on his bed with a gentleness that made her chest ache, his blue eyes searching her face in the dim light filtering through the windows. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw, the column of her throat, the line of her collarbone. "So impossibly beautiful." Melissa pulled him down to her, and when they finally gave themselves to each other, it was like finding something she hadn't known she'd been searching for. Christopher touched her like she was precious, like every curve and line of her dark skin was a revelation, and Melissa gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, showing him with every kiss and touch that he was worthy. that he was whole, that he was loved. They moved together in the darkness, whispered words of love and need and absolute certainty, and when they finally lay tangled together, Christopher's head on her chest, her fingers in his hair, the silence was full of everything they'd been too afraid to say. "I love you," Melissa whispered into the darkness. "I love you," Christopher replied, pressing a kiss above her heart. "I love you completely." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. And for the first time in months, Christopher didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of possibility. The weeks that followed were a revelation. They were inseparable. Melissa quit her job and took the position at Christopher and Andrew's company. They spent their days building something incredible and their nights learning every inch of each other. But in the quiet moments when Melissa talked about her nieces and nephews, when they walked past families in the park, when friends announced pregnancies, Christopher would feel it, the shadow of fear that he wasn't enough. That eventually, Melissa would realize what she'd given up for him. He didn't say it out loud, didn't voice the doubt that crept in during the dark hours, but Melissa could feel him pulling away slightly, could see the war still raging behind his eyes, and she knew that loving Christopher meant fighting for him, even when he tried to sabotage their happiness with his fear. The battle wasn't over yet. 6 months into their relationship, Christopher was drowning again, not in whiskey this time, but in fear. Melissa saw it in the way he'd pull back when their conversations turned to the future, in the forced smile when her sister FaceTimed with her newborn, in the careful distance he'd create between them whenever the world reminded him of what he believed he couldn't give her. It came to a head on a Tuesday evening. In their shared apartment, they'd moved in together 3 months ago, another step forward that Christopher had simultaneously celebrated and feared. Melissa was cooking dinner, telling him about a colleague's pregnancy announcement. When she felt it, the shift in the air, the way Christopher's body tensed beside her at the kitchen counter. "That's great for them," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he chopped vegetables. Melissa turned off the stove, set down her wooden spoon with deliberate calm. "Christopher, what? Stop." She turned to face him fully, her hazel eyes steady on his face. "Stop doing this." "Doing what?" But his jaw was tight, his blue eyes not quite meeting hers. "Pulling away from me." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Every time someone mentions babies, every time the future comes up, you disappear on me." Christopher set down the knife, his knuckles white against the counter. "I'm right here, Melissa." "No, you're not." She stepped closer, her voice rising despite herself. "You're somewhere in your head, convincing yourself that I'm making some terrible sacrifice by loving you. You're already mourning something you think I'll regret. You don't understand, then make me understand." The words burst out of her, months of watching him suffer spilling over. "Because I'm tired, Christopher. I'm tired of watching you punish yourself for something that isn't your fault. I'm tired of you deciding what I should want, what I should need, what I can handle." His jaw clenched. "I'm trying to protect you from what?" Melissa's voice cracked, her hands trembling at her sides. "From a life with you? From loving you? From choosing you every single day? From being disappointed?" Christopher's control finally snapped, his voice raw. "From waking up 5 years from now and realizing you settled for a broken man who can't give you the one thing every woman wants. Don't you dare." Melissa's eyes blazed. "Don't you dare tell me what I want. Don't you dare stand there and pretend you know better than me what will make me happy." "Melissa, I want you," she interrupted. The words echoed in their apartment, fierce and undeniable. Tears streamed down her bronze cheeks, her whole body shaking with the force of her emotion. "I want the man who makes me laugh until I can't breathe. I want the man who challenges me, who sees me, who loves me so fiercely I can feel it even when you're across the room. I want the life we're building together, whatever shape that takes." Christopher stared at her, his blue eyes wide with shock and pain, and something that looked like hope struggling to survive. Melissa closed the distance between them, her hand pressing against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. "You think you're being noble, but you're being a coward. You're letting fear steal our happiness because you think you know what's best for me." His voice broke. "I can't give you everything. You are everything." She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "You don't get to decide my future for me because you're afraid of yours. I chose you, Christopher William. Every single day I choose you. When are you going to choose us?" The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Then Christopher pulled her into his arms with a sound that was half sob, half relief, his face buried in her neck, his whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her skin. "Melissa, I'm so sorry." "You're right. You're absolutely right." She held him tight, her own tears soaking into his shirt. "I love you. Just you. Everything else we'll figure it out together. But you have to trust me. Trust that I know what I want. Trust that I'm not going anywhere." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I do trust you. I'm just terrified of losing you." "Then stop pushing me away." "No more," Christopher said, and it sounded like a vow. "I promise. No more pulling away. No more deciding for you what our future should look like. No more fear. Promise me." "I promise." He kissed her then, desperate and tender, and full of everything he'd been too afraid to say. And Melissa kissed him back, anchoring him the way she'd been doing since that first night on the beach, reminding him that love wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other, again and again in the broken places.
Wow. Love is truly beautiful.
2 weeks later, Christopher took her to Ocean Beach. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. That seemed impossible after the grey fog of the day. The wind whipped cold and sharp, carrying the salt spray smell that was quintessentially San Francisco. Surfers caught final waves, their silhouettes dark against the glowing water. Melissa walked beside him on the sand, barefoot, her hand warm in his. She was wearing a sundress that the wind pressed against her curves, her natural hair loose and wild around her face. "Why are we here?" she asked, though something in her chest told her she already knew. There was a nervousness to Christopher tonight, a barely contained energy that made her heart race. Christopher stopped walking, turned to face her, the sunset making his blue eyes luminous, catching the gold in his dark blonde hair. "Because this is where it started," he said softly. "Where you sat with me when I had nothing. Where you didn't ask me to be anything other than broken. Where you chose me before I learned how to choose myself." "Christopher." He knelt in the sand. Melissa's breath caught, her free hand flying to her mouth as tears immediately blurred her vision. Christopher pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and when he opened it, the ring inside caught the sunset and threw it back in brilliant colors, a diamond, surrounded by smaller stones that glinted like stars. "Melissa Richard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the strongest, most beautiful, most infuriating woman I have ever known. You saved my life not just that night, but every day since. You threw away my whiskey and made me eat breakfast. You forced me to shower and take walks, and remember that the world was still beautiful. You taught me that legacy isn't what you leave behind in a company or a bloodline." His voice broke, but he pushed through. "Legacy is what you build with someone who loves you without condition. It's the life we create together, the love we choose every single day, the way we make each other better just by existing in the same space." Melissa was openly crying now, her whole body trembling. "I don't know what our future holds," Christopher continued, his own tears falling freely. "But I know I want to face it with you. I know I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. I know I want to build something beautiful with you, whatever shape that takes. Melissa, will you marry me?" Yes, the word came out as a sob. She pulled him up and into her arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Christopher, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he was kissing her as the waves crashed behind them, and the sun sank into the Pacific. The fog began its evening roll across the beach, wrapping them in soft grey, but they didn't notice. They were too lost in each other, in the miracle of this moment, in the life stretching out before them bright with possibility. When they finally pulled apart, Christopher pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I was worth the risk." Melissa smiled through her tears. "You already have." They married 3 months later, in a small ceremony overlooking the bay. The venue was intimate, a historic mansion in Pacific Heights with floor-to-ceiling windows. That framed the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. 50 people filled the chairs, but Christopher barely saw any of them. He only had eyes for Melissa. She walked down the aisle in a dress that hugged her curves and caught the afternoon light, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo, with small white flowers woven through the coils. Her dark brown eyes found his, and the smile that broke across her face made Christopher's chest tight. Andrew stood beside him as best man, his own wife beaming from the front row, their toddler bouncing on her lap. Melissa's family filled the other side, her mother already crying happy tears, her sister holding her phone up to record every second. When Melissa reached him, Christopher took her hands and forgot how to breathe. The ceremony blurred. The officiant spoke words Christopher barely heard. All he could focus on was Melissa, the warmth of her hands, the joy in her eyes, the absolute certainty that this was right. "I vow to choose you," Christopher said when it was his turn, his voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Every day in every way for the rest of my life, I vow to trust your choices, to honor your strength, to never again let fear steal what we're building. I vow to build a legacy of love with you, Melissa. Whatever that looks like, however it unfolds, just us together." Melissa's voice was strong despite her tears. "I vow to be your anchor when the world feels like it's drowning you, to remind you when you forget that you're worthy of love, of happiness, of everything good. I vow to choose you too, Christopher, in the broken places and the beautiful ones, in the fear and in the joy always." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Christopher pulled Melissa into a kiss that made the small crowd erupt in cheers and whistles. But they barely heard it. They were too lost in each other, in the miracle of this moment, in the life they were about to build together. Later at the reception, Andrew raised his glass. To Christopher and Melissa, two people who prove that second chances are real, that love can heal the deepest wounds, and that the best partnerships are built on friendship, trust, and refusing to give up on each other. To legacy, the room echoed. Christopher looked at his wife, and knew that he'd already found his. 2 years of marriage flew by like a dream. The company Christopher and Andrew built exceeded every projection. Their AI integration system revolutionized how businesses handled data security, making them both wealthier than Christopher had been before Victoria's betrayal. Forbes ran a cover story, "The Phoenix Rises," how Christopher William built an empire from ashes. But this time, the wealth meant something different. It was built on partnership, on innovation, on second chances. Christopher worked hard but didn't let work consume him, because he had something worth coming home to. Melissa thrived as their head of marketing, her vision and creativity helping to launch them into the stratosphere. She had an instinct for what people wanted, how to tell a story that resonated. Under her leadership, their brand became synonymous with innovation and integrity. They bought a house in Pacific Heights, with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, not the penthouse where Christopher had drowned in whiskey and self-pity, but a Victorian with character and history and room to grow. Melissa filled it with plants and art and light. They hosted dinners for friends. They took long walks through the city. They built a life they never tried to conceive, never tracked cycles or scheduled intimacy, or went to specialists. They talked about adoption, about fostering, about the many ways to build a family. But mostly they just loved each other and let that be enough. "Are you happy?" Melissa asked one night, curled against him on their couch, watching the fog roll across the bay. Christopher kissed the top of her head. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Me too," and it was true. For 2 years they built something beautiful, something whole, something that had nothing to do with what they couldn't have, and everything to do with what they chose, until one morning when everything changed. Melissa woke up nauseous. She told herself it was the sushi from the night before they'd celebrated, Andrew's latest prototype success at their favorite place in Japantown. But when it happened again the next morning, and the morning after that, a tiny seed of impossible hope took root in her chest. A week later, hands shaking, she took a pregnancy test in their master bathroom, while Christopher was in the shower. She sat on the closed toilet lid, the test face down on the counter, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. The water shut off. Christopher's off-key humming drifted through the steam. "Please," she thought. "Please, please, please." She flipped the test over. 2 lines. Melissa stared at them, her vision blurring with tears. "2 impossibly, miraculously pink lines, babe," Christopher called, stepping out of the shower with a towel around his waist, water still dripping from his hair. "You okay? You're being quiet, and that usually means you're planning something." He stopped. Melissa was sitting on the toilet, tears streaming down her face, holding something small and white in her trembling hands. "Melissa," fear crept into his voice. "What's wrong?" She couldn't speak, just held up the test. Christopher froze. His blue eyes went from her face to the test and back again, and she watched understanding dawn like sunrise breaking through fog. "Is that," his voice cracked, "is that real? I'm pregnant." The words came out as a whisper, like speaking them too loud might make them disappear. "Christopher, I'm pregnant." The test fell from her hands as Christopher dropped to his knees in front of her, his face a mask of shock and disbelief and overwhelming joy. He picked up the test with shaking hands, staring at those 2 pink lines like they were a miracle, written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. How, he asked, his voice breaking on the word. The doctors said they said 1%. I don't know. Melissa cupped his face, her own tears falling freely now. I don't know how. But it's real, baby. It's real. Christopher's face crumpled. He pressed his forehead against her stomach, his shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. All the shame he'd carried, all the fear that he was less than a man, all the nights he'd lain awake wondering if Melissa would wake up and regret choosing him. Gone, shattered, healed in the space of 2 pink lines. Melissa held him as he cried, her fingers threading through his wet hair, her own tears soaking into his shoulder. You were never broken, she whispered. Do you hear me? You were never broken. He looked up at her, his face wet with tears and wonder. We're going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby, she confirmed, laughing through her tears. Christopher stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her down gently, like she was made of glass. He kissed her desperate and tender and reverent, pouring 2 years of impossible hope into the reality of this moment. I love you, he said against her lips. Melissa, I love you so much. I love you too. They stood there in their bathroom, still in their pajamas, the morning light streaming through the window, holding each other and their impossible miracle. And for the first time, since those doctors had delivered their verdict years ago, Christopher felt whole. 6 months later, Christopher walked into the headquarters of Williams Tech, with his pregnant wife by his side. Melissa was radiant at 30 weeks, her belly round and beautiful. Carrying what they'd learned were triplets. 3 impossible miracles. 3 reasons Christopher now walked with his head high, and his hand protective on the small of his wife's back. The receptionist's eyes widened when she recognized him. Mr. William, I didn't know you had an appointment. I don't need one, Christopher said calmly. Tell Victoria that her ex-husband is here with an offer. Tell her I'll wait exactly 10 minutes. They sat in the lobby, the same lobby where he'd once walked with pride, before everything crumbled. Melissa squeezed his hand. You okay? Better than okay. He looked at her, at the swell of her belly, at the life they'd built from ashes. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. 8 minutes later, they were escorted to the boardroom, the same room where he'd been voted out 4 years ago, the same table where his life had imploded. Victoria sat at the head, his old seat, and Christopher felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, just a calm certainty that this was closure, not revenge. She'd aged. The stress of running a company that had lost its innovation showed in the lines around her eyes, the tightness of her mouth. Her gaze went from Christopher to Melissa's pregnant belly and back again, and something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe regret. What do you want, Christopher? Victoria asked, her voice carefully neutral. He slid a folder across the polished table. I want to buy you out. Every share. Every patent. Every piece of this company. Here's my offer. Victoria opened the folder. Her face went pale as she read the number. It was more than fair, it was generous. And it was non-negotiable. You can't be serious. Dead serious. Christopher leaned back, his hand finding Melissa's on top of the table where Victoria could see, where she could see the wedding band, the intimacy, the absolute confidence. You took this company from me when I was broken. Now I'm buying it back whole. The board will never approve. The board will do whatever you tell them to, Christopher interrupted. We both know that. You have 48 hours to accept, and if I don't? Christopher smiled, not cruel, just certain. Then I'll launch a competing product that will bury you in 6 months. Andrew and I have the technology, the patents, the momentum. You know we do. You've been watching. Victoria looked between them at Christopher's calm confidence, at Melissa's protective hand on her belly, at the way they sat together like an immovable force, at everything she'd tried to take from him and failed. You seem different, she said finally, and there was something almost wistful in her voice. I am different, Christopher replied. I learned what actually matters. I learned that legacy isn't about empire or bloodlines, or proving something to people who don't matter. His hand tightened on Melissa's. It's about love. Building something real with someone who sees you, all of you, and chooses you anyway. Something you never understood, Victoria. Something you never wanted. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria looked down at the offer. at the number that would make her wealthy beyond measure, but would cost her the last piece of Christopher's old life, at the company that had been slowly dying without his vision to drive it forward. "I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers," she said quietly. Christopher stood, helping Melissa to her feet. 48 hours. As they walked out of the building, his building soon, Melissa looked up at him. "How do you feel?" Christopher took a deep breath of San Francisco air salt and fog and possibility. Free. 3 months later, on a foggy March morning, Melissa went into labor. It happened fast. One moment she was making breakfast. The next she was gripping the counter, her water breaking in a rush that sent Christopher into controlled panic mode. Okay. He grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago. "We're okay. You're okay. I'm calling the doctor." "Christopher." Melissa's voice cut through his spiraling. "Breathe, baby. I'm the one in labor." He laughed, high and slightly hysterical, but he breathed. The drive to UCSF Medical Center was a blur. Christopher gripped the steering wheel, trying not to speed, trying not to imagine everything that could go wrong. Melissa breathed through contractions beside him, her hand on her belly, talking softly to their babies. "Almost there, little ones. We can't wait to meet you." The hospital room was bright and filled with the kind of controlled chaos that comes with delivering triplets. Dr. Patel was calm and efficient, the nursing staff moving with practiced precision. Christopher held Melissa's hand, his other hand stroking her hair, his heart in his throat. "You're doing amazing," he whispered. "So strong, baby, so strong." Melissa squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. Her brown skin sheened with sweat, her face a mask of determination and pain. "Tell me again," she gasped between contractions. "Tell you what?" "That you love me." Christopher's eyes filled with tears. "I love you." "God, Melissa, I love you more than anything in this world. You're my miracle. You're everything. You're—" "Push," Dr. Patel commanded. And Melissa pushed. The hours blurred together, pain and pressure, and Melissa's grip on his hand like a lifeline. Christopher felt useless, helpless, in awe of the woman bringing their children into the world, through sheer force of will. Then suddenly, miraculously, a cry, high and thin and absolutely perfect. "Baby A," Dr. Patel announced. "A boy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Christopher's knees went weak. A nurse placed the tiny, squirming bundle on Melissa's chest, and they both stared down at their son, with identical expressions of wonder. "Hi, baby," Melissa sobbed, touching the tiny face. "Hi, sweet boy." But there was no time to process. 2 more were coming. 15 minutes later, baby B, another boy. 6 pounds, 11 ounces. 20 minutes after that, baby C, a girl. 6 pounds, 8 ounces. 3 babies, 2 boys and a girl. Perfect and tiny and screaming with healthy lungs that announced to the world that they were here. They were real, they were impossible made flesh. The nurses cleaned them, checked them, assigned them perfect APGAR scores. Then they brought them back 3 tiny bundles and placed them in Melissa and Christopher's arms. Christopher stared down at his children, and the world tilted on its axis. The son cradled in his left arm had his blue eyes. The daughter in Melissa's arms had her mother's nose. The second son in the bassinet beside them had Christopher's blonde hair, already showing impossible and perfect. "You were never broken," Melissa whispered, looking up at Christopher with exhausted, joyful eyes that held the weight of everything they'd survived. The words hit him like a physical force. All the shame he'd carried, all the fear, all the certainty that he was less than a man, because his body had failed in the one way that mattered. Gone, shattered by 3 tiny miracles sleeping in his arms. Christopher carefully placed the babies in their bassinet. Then he dropped to his knees beside her hospital bed, his hands raised toward heaven, his face tilted up, tears streaming down his face unchecked. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking on each word. "Thank you, God. Thank you for Melissa. Thank you for our children. Thank you for second chances. Thank you for showing me that I was never broken, just becoming. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." His whole body shook with the force of his gratitude, with the overwhelming joy of a man who'd been given back everything he thought he'd lost. Melissa reached down, her fingers threading through his hair, her own tears falling freely. The morning sun broke through the fog outside the window, flooding the room with golden light. It caught on Melissa's brown skin, on the 3 tiny faces in the bassinet, on Christopher's bowed head. Their family, 3 impossible miracles, 1 fierce woman, and 1 man who'd learned that being broken was just another word for being human. That legacy wasn't about perfection or bloodlines or empire. It was about love, unconditional, all-consuming, transformative love. It was about choosing each other in the broken places. It was about second chances and redemption, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Christopher stayed on his knees, hands raised in gratitude, while Melissa watched him with love in her eyes, and their children slept the sleep of the newly born. Outside, San Francisco woke to another day fog and traffic, and the endless rhythm of the bay. But in that hospital room, time stood still. A man thanked God. A woman remembered her strength. 3 babies dreamed their first dreams, and a legacy was born not of empire or wealth or bloodline, but of love that refused to be broken. Their story was just beginning.
Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build with someone who sees you whole, even when you feel shattered. It's the family you create through faith, through love, through refusing to give up on the impossible. Christopher and Melissa's story reminds us that our worth isn't tied to what we can produce or provide. It's inherent in who we are and who we choose to love. Thank you for spending your time with Vintage Mike Tales.